For 10 sessions, we've been following the footsteps of Moses through the Sinai, and I hope that you've been moving towards spiritual maturity. I hope that you're closer to God now than you were when we started. You've noticed, I'm sure, the way we have begun each one of these sessions. It's significant because the blowing of the shofar, the sounding of the ram's horn, is a signal to come up higher. It's a call to worship, a sound to be up and moving. One of the important lessons we need to learn in the wilderness as we move towards spiritual maturity is the fact that we're all pilgrims. That was one of the first lessons that God taught those children of Israel, the lesson of staying under the cloud. God knew that it would be easy for those former slaves to settle down and get comfortable. Therefore, the first order of business was to keep them moving. How can you reach your goal to spiritual maturity if you're not on the move? A friend of mine once told me that he joined a church and the pastor said to him, "Have a seat." And he said he's been doing that ever since. You see, you'll never reach your spiritual maturity if you remain seated. You journey to maturity. When you speak of the Holy Spirit, you speak of the move of the Holy Spirit. In the wilderness, the Israelites were told to keep their eye on the cloud and to stay under it. Now, today, I want you to come with me to a special location, high on the side of Mount Sinai. There's a place where the old hermits had their caves during the 4th and 5th century. It overlooks St. Catherine's Monastery, 1,000 feet below, 2,000 feet below. Listen in as I teach about the ram's horn, about the danger of being a hermit, and about the necessity of being a pilgrim moving through the wilderness to the Promised Land. We're at the 6,000-foot level. Been climbing up from St. Catherine's Monastery, and here we are at this little place called a farsh, which is actually a high mountain oasis. Been able to fill our canteens. The water tastes good, high up. It's an interesting thing about this place. This is especially where Elijah came, and fleeing from Jezebel. Well, the question that so many of us ask is that after we have been through the desert, after we've been through the wilderness, and have entered the promised land of salvation and the Spirit-filled life, why do we so often find ourselves back in the wilderness? Perhaps the reason that we ask the question is because we really misunderstand what the promised land is. The wilderness is really not a bad place to live. We've discovered that as we've walked through this Sinai wilderness, that a person can live here and live rather comfortably for long periods of time. The children of Israel were here, and it was a good place for them. Sure, they were out of the will of God and they were wandering, but they had free food every morning, manna from heaven. Their clothes didn't wear out, their shoes didn't wear out, they were protected from the snakes. It was a pretty good place to be. Wildernesses are like that, and there's always a temptation to want to stay in the wilderness rather than move on to the promised land, because the promised land has to be taken. Salvation is free. We understand that. It's a gift of God. It's God's grace. But salvation then has to be worked out. The promised land has to be worked out. Those men who went in there had to fight the giants of Anak, and they had to capture the wall cities. Perhaps that's the meaning of this farsh that we're at. Elijah had tasted of the promised land. He lived in the promised land. And then suddenly he found himself forced back into it. He had a great victory up at Mount Carmel. You remember the biblical story of how he had overcome the priests of Baal, and fire had come from heaven, and then the very next day he's fleeing for his life. 3 days it took him running to get to this place. And when he got here, he felt exhausted and began to doubt his own salvation. What in the world is a man who has tasted of the promised land doing back in the wilderness? It was at this place, just below the summit of Mount Sinai, that God spoke again to Elijah. The poet says, "On Horeb with Elijah let us lie, where all around on mountain, sand, and sky, God's chariot wheels have left distinctest trace." Maybe that's the reason for the wildernesses in our lives, so that we can see God's chariot wheels, the place where God has been, and hear again his still small voice as it speaks to us. Elijah came from that place of great victory. You know, there's such a tendency inside of every one of us to want to see the sensational, to want to see the hand of God. And yet God is not so interested in revealing his hand as he is in us seeing his face and hearing his voice. And so the purpose of the Farsh, the high mountain oasis where we can get quiet and stop, be refreshed, and listen and hear the voice of God. God spoke again. Elijah laying out here in this quiet place. There was wind, and there was earthquake, and there was fire, and yet God was not in any of that. It was only when all of that had passed that God spoke in a still small voice. And so we hear his voice again, quiet, soft, at the Farsh.